Chief McFee, big year from high number of police incidents to the Pope being in town and Edmonton police officers being tasked with taking care of some of the security there. But I wanted to start with guns because we've 3 times had the head of the Guns and Gangs unit come and talk to reporters about large rash of gun violence in a short period of time. From your perspective, what is happening in our city?
Well, I mean, Carly, as you and I talked about before, and I'll start with this and then I'll get into the guns, but when we, in year 1 of COVID, we brought in a psychologist to kind of talk to us on, what we could expect COVID and some of the remnants of COVID, and basically told us domestic violence is good chance it's going to go up, child abuse, good chance it's going to go up, mental health and addictions, obviously, probably for sure going to go up. Gun violence, if you think about when we talked, 2 years ago, everybody thought the world was going to end. They're taking guns out of Cabela's and stacking up on guns and toilet paper. And then obviously officer wellness was going to go down. So that whole thing in relation to that, we've seen a North American trend that's actually taking place right now, which is a lot more guns on the street, a lot more use of guns. So I mean, as we all know, a legitimate gun owner doesn't pull a trigger at somebody else. So the concern and the number of shootings that we've had in relation to that, some of the traveling in relation to the gang violence that's happened, and as I said, across North America, but certainly in some of our Canadian cities, is a concern for us. And it's ultimately why in our budget, one of the things that we propose this year is to increase our gang strategy. So as you know, we put some pretty good things in place. We have our own firearms ballistic lab now to study. It solves some pretty serious shootings in a very, very quick time frame, along with our rapid DNA and some of the stuff. But now we need to expand that just because of some of this. And we're pulling guns out of vehicles every day now. Like whether it's 1 or 2 guns, and some of them are just out of traffic stops. And then of course you get the gang violence and everything else. So it is something that's with us right now for a while, and it's something that needs attention, and it needs to be done from not just an enforcement perspective, but our strategy is also, get the guns off the street, hold the people accountable that are pulling the triggers, but it's also to work on a way to get those people that are in gang life, try to get them out of the gang, because ultimately, as you know, that just gets filled by somebody else. So it's something we're aware of. We have lots of good intelligence on it. It's an active file. We got people, and we're trying to expand the number of people working on it just because of, as you mentioned, how we've seen these numbers go up. And as I said, it's quite a significant number. It's obviously worse in the U.S., but there's Canadian cities, a lot of the larger cities are starting to see some of the trends. And of course, from a violence perspective, it's just not acceptable.
Mm-hmm. Violence perspective, we had a mass shooting outside a nightclub as well. It's been hard to get a yes or no answer for lots of these cases if gangs are definitely involved. And I keep hearing that the gangs are evolving. We're not having classic gangs that we had in the past.
There definitely is gangs are involved, and I think gang or drug related. I think of our 27 homicides right now. I think we can probably say for sure at least 10 to 13 involve drugs or gangs. And I think what we're seeing is a lot of those things in relation to these random drive-by shootings and stuff. There's definitely some gang involvement in that. We don't get into logistics because obviously those are things that we're working on. But, and you take the one that you mentioned in a nightclub, that one, just because of our rapid DNA, because we had Air 1 involved, the infrared, we managed to get 4 people in custody and track those firearms in hours, not weeks and months, and get people in custody. So that's why we're doing these strategies. That example is obviously you want to stop those things from happening, but if people come into our city or in our city and decide to create harm and violence against others, we're going to hold them accountable, and we're going to be relentless on that. So I think you're bang on. It's something that we're in a large city that's got potential for that to happen, and we need to make sure that we're investing and we're doing things right in that space, because that stuff's just not acceptable.
There's obviously a lot of political talk around guns right now. I wanted to get your perspective on how this impacts Edmonton police. Are the guns you're seizing every day ones that could be impacted by gun control? Will it make a difference on the ground? And then we also have the element of the province saying that they're going to tell the RCMP to not enforce federal things. Can they direct Edmonton police? Would you even be policing this?
Well, I mean, the law is the law. If you're talking about a law that we have to enforce, I mean, we're required by law. We do have discretion, but I mean, obviously you have to enforce the law. But, you know, and I mentored the assistant chief of Phoenix. He was just here for the last week and looking and, you know, sharing some stories, and he's seeing some of the things that we're doing, some of the progressive things we have. But I mean, the piece that's a policy on that is the buyback program. And quite frankly, and we had a long discussion about this with the executive team and him, and we've talked about the ACP, that's not going to help. The people that are going to turn their guns on aren't the people that are pulling the triggers. We need to focus on the people pulling the triggers and that are actually creating the violence. There needs to be an accountable justice system to ensure that these people are dealt with appropriately. But, you know, I think we got to be careful, and I think that's the whole political debate, is we need to focus on the enforcement perspective, putting the resources in there, also in the intervention to get people out of the gang life and out of this lifestyle. But at the same time, these are the people that need to be held accountable with our justice system, and I'm not sure that we're actually getting to those people when you talk about buyback programs, because they really haven't had a major impact. And quite frankly, it's just going to put another wedge between police and community in an area that's not going to make the difference. So when I gave evidence at the parliamentary committee, one of the things I said is focus on the people that are actually, you know, doing the harm and pulling the triggers. And the only way to do that is through a multidiscipline enforcement, intervention, prevention plan. And so that's what we've been focusing on.
Mm-hmm. Now, when we go to police funding, we know that it's always the debate, per capita versus per call cost, but the taxpayer sees it as per capita, we're spending more than other similar cities. So what's happening right now to look for efficiencies?
Well, I mean, I could give you 50 probably examples from, you know, we just collapsed into a 10 squad model, 32 different units to put people in there. We've redone our zoning bylaws, our areas to ensure driving time, increase visibility. You know, we've got rapid DNA, we've got the IBIS machine, how we can use technology. You know, we've got the help team that's got a 30% success rate, and now 60% for the really serious people, taking people out of the justice system. So you actually reduce the calls for service. The PAC team. Honestly, we've done a ton of this, probably more so than any city that I've ever seen in North America. I think that whole perspective, though, of the cost, keep in mind that those cost-benefit analysis were done on 3 regionalized police services. Anytime you have a regionalized police service, you drop your costs. So if you're going to compare that, you have to look at what you're servicing as an area. And Edmonton's in a unique position because they service, obviously, a feeder system of up to another 300,000 to 500,000. So the cost-benefit analysis in relation to that, I think we got to be careful, because the Edmonton Police Service budget as a proportion of budget hasn't changed for several years. Like, I mean, actually it went from 15% of budget down to 14%, and that was the whole reason of a funding formula. And the other piece of that is everybody's trying to put a spin on police budget. When you look at it over the net growth from the last 10 years, so just talking net growth, and we can provide you with that chart from the last 10 years, the police service has grown by 49%. The city's grown by 73%. The city has grown, and part of growing is having a safety component. And Edmonton has disproportionate social issues as a hub, that disproportionately crime rate. And for 3 years, we went hard at that and we reduced it by 21%. Then we cut money, or we're not going to say cut, because the spin again is we cut pre-approved budget that was actually basically targeted to go into the hotspot areas that we built a perimeter around to be strong. And that was, as I've said many times, 118th, Chinatown, the Macaulay, downtown, LRT. And that was not allowed to do just because you didn't have the ability and the financial ability to do that. So then a really severe tragedy happens in Chinatown, 2 folks, and I mean, that's just a horrific story. And then all of a sudden we're now refunding that. So now we're 18 months behind because we got to recruit, we got to fill it. So now we've moved people from other parts, our members from other parts of our service. So what happens now is you just start to displace it, and other areas start to see the displacement. So when you invest in safety, you have to have a plan. Edmonton Police Service reconfigured a lot of their budget money for 3 years. We were way ahead of this curve, even pre-George Floyd, even pre-COVID. But then we weren't allowed to finish what we started. And what you're going to see this year, I'm pretty confident to say, numbers are going to go way up because we didn't get to the areas we need to. Did we try to? Did we present that? Yes, we presented it. So I think when you actually focus on safety, focus on outcomes, and stop making it a budget spin, because even last year when that cut went, the city budget still went up, the police went down. even as a proportionate thing. And then for the last year and a half, we haven't had an increase, so everybody else has. I think basically, I was just speaking in Dallas, certainly the defund the police program type thing, detask, it hasn't worked. It's been a failure in the U.S. and violence is up exponentially, homicides are up exponentially. You take places like Minneapolis that went through it right at the heart of it. They've had serious increases in those. They're 800 police officers short, and they've had less than 100 applications. So there's not good things that happen out of this rhetoric and this talk. You need to have to be a well-being community. You need a safe community. My job is to try to use what we have to actually have a safe community. The whole point of that whole thing is when we did that exercise compared to others is the funding formula against others showed that their budgets would have come down. So the funding formula, think of it as a salary cap type thing, actually is designed to deal with all that, to deal with inflation, to deal with city growth, to deal with capital growth. When you're in absence of that, it just becomes you're at the mercy of maybe some folks that really don't understand policing. And then the other point is we have a police commission. And you look at our budget process this year, before we even got into that in capital, our capital growth was actually reduced by 62 million before we even went to City Council. I think it's something that we need to be aware of because safety is absolutely paramount. And Edmonton has had disproportionate, but we did have 3 years of success, which we're losing those gains. And I find that hard to believe.
How do you know that those gains are lost because of funding and not because of the pandemic?
Well, I think you could, because we're comparing those gains to other areas. So we disproportionately closed the gap on all cities that we measure against, certainly on the Canadian average. We reduced our violence, reduced our property crime at a disproportionate, and other crime at a disproportionate rate than any other city as a comparative, so which brought our average down. That's how we compare those things. And again, when you compare budgets of policing to other cities, I talked about regionalization. If you take us in Calgary, Calgary doesn't have their dispatch center in their budget. They don't have their fleet management and a couple other things. So those are big numbers for us. Those are 20, 30, 40 million dollars. That disproportionately sets your number. So what I really, really caution about is just using exercises that to spin your agenda, and that concerns me. And I go a little bit further. I've been in policing, so I've been a chief in another province. I've been a deputy minister. I've been president of CACP. I've been involved in a lot of different things. I've been in this business for a long time, and we do our risk audit at the Edmonton Police Service every year. And that basically is look at all our organizations, talk to our people. What do you think the biggest risks are? The two top risks are politicization of policing and member wellness. And I think we all can obviously see the relationship that they're having trouble, our recruiting's way down. You're having trouble hiring nurses right now. The pandemic, a lot of these things that they're facing has been hard. EMS, we're acting as the ambulance a lot of times right now because EMS is code red and they don't have enough staff. So this is the whole thing, and I know you're probably going to get into this question at some point. That's why we need leadership in this space. Somebody needs to take ownership of this space to ensure that we keep this stuff stable, because if we don't, it disrupts communities. And back to the whole thing is, if people can't run a business and a viable business because of some of the social harms that are out here, that's a concern.
I'm sorry, just before we move on to...
Go ahead and take a drink.
Yeah. Yeah, before we get to the topic of leadership, you mentioned code red and officers are taking people to hospitals.
Yeah, we've had several calls now where ambulances just say that we're tied up, we're not going to be able to get there, where we just have to actually transport in our police cars.
And is that common? Has that happened before?
That shouldn't happen. And it's not because they're not working their tails off, it's just because sometimes it's busy. Mm-hmm. And that tells you something about some of the issues in your city.
Mm-hmm. Now, when it comes to a sort of funding of the social sectors, you're on a new task force that's going to look at that. But from the numbers we've seen, Edmonton disproportionately, again, we're comparing to Calgary, doesn't get the same amount of funding for shelters, doesn't get as much provincial dollars for these types of things. Do you hope this task force will bridge that gap and some of the systemic gaps that exist because of that?
So I was on as you probably know, because I think we've talked about this, Mental Health and Addictions Task Force. I was on the Human Trafficking Task Force, and I was on the co-chair of the Homeless and Minimum Standard Shelters. That came up in that task force. And if you remember that money, part of that money that was given was to basically offset that disproportion. That's what that money was for. It's right in the speech and right in that. So that's been addressed to some extent. The whole point here is we keep making this about money, and you're seeing, and you just seen it in BC, which I found was really interesting. So you got a total different political party and a total different political party here getting to the same place. And when that happens, maybe something's on the right track. If we think that the only thing that's going to solve our problem here is build housing, I can tell you based on all these task forces, we get zero chance of success, zero. There's a huge addictions and mental health issue here that we need to build a system, and part of that system is going to be housing. It's important. Part of that is going to be harm reduction, but we also need treatment. We need the ability to give people the help they need as close to real time. And getting back to that whole thing, seeing the province as the main funder jump into the leadership because maybe the direction isn't going anywhere that's getting any kind of outcomes that are needed to address the gaps, I think is a positive thing. And then putting a bunch of community leaders in their own right in relation to that are actually dealing with the aftermath of that is very, very smart. And you're seeing that not just in this province. It needs a different approach. If you look at our homeless population, how many of them are from here? Nobody actually knows that answer. But what we can tell you, we disproportionately see a lot of people from the city, and I would say it's by far the majority. And unless we have a parallel system in maybe some of the Indigenous nations, and we have something in Wetaskiwin, we have something in Grand Prairie and a couple other communities that disproportionately feed that, and we deal with what's coming out of the correctional facilities and the hospitals, we're not going to succeed. So it needs some new innovation. And I think this task force has the ability with various different people and obviously listen to other people to take the 3 actual task force that were done, a little bit more input, and actually get to implementation. Because we don't need to work on the problem anymore. We need to focus on things that work that aren't one-dimensional. One-dimensional solutions in a space that's very complex is not going to work. And I think the other thing is, rather than think we're going to solve homelessness or addictions or whatever it is in a year, months, how about we get 20% out of the system and get people help and get some actual hope back into the system? Because right now, I tell you, I've talked to shelter people working in shelters, I've talked to vulnerable people, I've talked to a lot of the people that are running these different social services. There's not a lot of hope right now. And I see this as a way to get some of that back, but it's got to happen quickly.
Is there anything that can be done before the end of the year?
100%. Well, the end of the year is 2 weeks, but within the first 30, 60 days, absolutely. There's a whole list of these things that we can get going on, which we certainly from a police service perspective, we've been working on with some of our sector partners and some of our partners to do like the navigators and a whole bunch of different things. There's no place to take the people that are kicked out of shelters or banned from shelters. We need a place to stabilize. We just got our results back from our 6-month analysis on our Sublocade and Suboxone in our DMUs, and it's showing some great reductions, not just in overdoses, but getting people out of the justice system into the health system. That's a positive for us. Those are things that we can be doing and should be doing all the time, and they're showing results. So we've been pretty fortunate. All the things that we've moved so far are pretty much all tracking as positive, so that's good. But you're starting at such a deficit in this community because it's been for years and COVID's exposed it. It can't just be pointing fingers and blaming people. We need a different approach. It's almost tiring listening to it, actually. Let's get at it and let's help people.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to sort of the question of ways to tackle open-air drug use, there's been a lot of talk about safe consumption sites in our city and what's happening there. Where do you see that type of harm reduction in the bigger picture with all the other systems?
Well, I mean, when you talk about open-air drug use, it's no different than what we've talked about. Every person's different, right? If you're using meth and you're violent, well, then probably it needs a different approach. If you're using fentanyl and you're looking like you're loopy or, there's some risk at you, maybe that's a ride to the safe consumption site. If that's what you're using and that's what you're doing, and then you have some health folks there. If you're just out there and you're going to stab somebody, well, that's a justice system thing. The reality is we're trying to put all of these people in the same approach and call them houseless and homeless, and it's not the case. We have a lot of our criminals that are disproportionately preying on our vulnerable, because if you want to move product being illicit drugs, where's the best way to move it? Find the folks that have some addictions issues, find the folks that are always moving around, and that's where you go. And I mean, that's not just an Edmonton thing, that's a North American thing. Look at what's happened in Vancouver. They've now come in and they're reversing their whole approach. Look at what's happened in San Francisco. They're reversing their whole approach. Seattle reversing the whole approach. The reality is you can't have a blanket thing thinking housing is the solution. It's just one of those domains. What you're really missing in this city and many others is a system thinking, which, as you said, harm reduction is part of it, housing is part of it, but addictions treatment needs to be right in there, mental health. And from us perspective is we control 100% intake in the justice system. We go to most of these calls. So if we are trained and we have the right partners, how much of this can we divert out of the justice system into the health system? I think that's a big answer. If you study the law enforcement public health that started in the UK, and I've talked about this often, there's some big results coming out of here, but it's to put partnerships together. It's not just to move money from one to the other, because if you're using meth, there's a really good chance it's not going to be safe. You go with a partnership. If it's not safe, the police lead. If it's safe, then perhaps the addictions worker leads. And then the relentless follow-up is the important piece.
Mm-hmm. I want to move on to officer accountability. I think it was sitting right here last year, you said when your officers do something wrong, you'll own it and not to be judged based on actions outside of Edmonton. But this year, for an example, I spoke to the sister of a man who was killed by police. He was an innocent bystander sitting in his apartment. They've been told they have to wait for commission to look at it until an ACERT investigation. They've been told police will look at it after an ACERT investigation, but we know these investigations take time. Do you think that there will be a reduction in the timeline it takes for these investigations? And what are you doing in the meantime to connect with these families?
Right, so once ACERT is involved, they're autonomous to us, and so we can't get involved. So ACERT is the communication arm, ACERT's the investigator, and all of that's for ensuring accountability, ensuring that there's no influence from the service. In this particular file, ACERT has the lead. ACERT, does contact the family. I'm not sure what's happened in this particular case, and they do provide things. I think the whole thing about ACERT and the improvements that we made by some of the staff additions and going to this new transparency model is all going to depend on timeliness of how many people they have and how quickly they can get through this. We have seen an uptake in how quick they're getting to things, which is a positive sign, but I think, and you've heard me say that from day one, timeliness is important, communication is important. For instance, I'll give you one in our homicides. We've now hired navigators on our homicide in relation to making sure the family's kept in the loop of what's happening. And those are things that we're doing internally, and that actually came out of our commitment to action, and something that we actually got from the public, and it was some of our Somali mothers that basically it said is, what broke my heart, and I think I might even talked about this last year, was when they said that they were praying to have daughters because their sons are getting killed. And then one of the things they said, we could really use a liaison to inform us and keep us in the pulse. So we're doing that on a lot of our serious crime, but I mean, those are things also that from an ACERT perspective, as we build this out as a provincial model, I think are absolutely things that people want to be kept in the loop, and people should be kept in the loop. You got to be careful because there's interviews and everything else, but it doesn't mean that you can't keep them in the loop.
Mm-hmm. And that Police Act review, I mean, it took 6 years, 3 premiers to get to some answers. Do you think we have enough of the answers to bring down those timelines? I mean, there was a file from Edmonton that was over 3 years, almost 4 years to clear officers. That can't be easy for your members either.
No, it works both ways. You're right. I do think it's there now. It's an amendment act, so sometimes it's confusing to actually read. But I think the staples of what we need to do, and removing HR issues from discipline issues, and staffing up an ACERT type model for independence to actually look at this, I think are all those things that will actually reduce that. And I mean, That's what we should be demanding, because that's the reason we're changing, right? And I am optimistic that will happen and we'll get to better product. And it's funny, it's one of those things where all the police chiefs and all the police associations have been saying this for years. And to your point, it's finally got done, and thankfully it got done. And to your other point is it's also across both parties. So it's not like we haven't been, and that's why it kind of, it's not humorous because it's almost sad, is both parties have worked on this and all of a sudden it's a bad idea. I don't get this. Like I honestly don't understand it. We've all been asking for this for a long time, and then all of a sudden somebody's trying to spin it into a political discussion. No, this is a good safety move and a good accountability move.
Mm-hmm. There are some questions in there about the mechanisms, if it will really be accountable to the public.
Well, and that's the whole thing that needs to be worked out in the regs. But I mean, all of those things have to be reported, right? Because there's always, even when we have to report it, there's always going to be a year-end report. So there is reporting mechanisms built in.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I mean, you touched on political polarization, but we also just saw community polarization over so many different issues in recent years. We started off the year in February. We had a few weekend protests where there was an injunction from Edmonton about honking and sound downtown that some residents didn't feel like it was enforced. How did those protests play out from a policing perspective?
I mean, I think we did what we could as the best we could. And I mean, there's always, you debrief those and you look at it. I think as you saw the numbers go down, you saw enforcement go up. That's just because from a practical standpoint. I think the best thing there is there was no injury in relation to, the injunction. As we spoke about before, that injunction really didn't do anything for us because the way it was worded probably didn't help us at all. What I think most thing that I feel best about is nobody got seriously hurt. What I take away from that, it's to your point, is kind of the whole environment we're in is it polarized the community. We had 501 protests this year. 4 years ago, we had 187. We have a full-time crew working on protests. And honestly, there's protests on just about everything. So I mean, it's when you look at things of big scale, like the first one, thousands of people with large trucks. I mean, the thing is to keep them moving, keep the city safe. And yes, it was inconvenience. And yes, I understand how frustrating that was because I heard some of the horn honking. But the best part of that is nobody was injured. And we finally got through it, other than seeing what happened in Ottawa or what played out in the Coots border. So I hope that we just continue to progress and get better at it, and it's something that we're always evaluating every one of them. And when you have 507 of them, it just speaks to the volume we're actually dealing with.
Yeah, and obviously it's protests varying in size, but some of those large protests do end up costing a lot of police resources.
100%. You can't not staff it because you got to staff for the unexpected, right? So 100%.
Looking back, a case that stood out in my files and stood out in every reporter in the city's files was a missing Edmonton teen right at the end of the school year, found in Oregon.
Yeah.
A man there charged with horrific crimes, now working through the U.S. legal system. How did that play out for Edmonton police in the investigation, and what are the next steps?
Well, I mean, first of all, it was great police work. I mean, our member that led that file and the members involved and the cross-border stuff and the different agencies involved just shows when, how well we're equipped to deal with really, really serious measures. Right now, I just saw that trial is put off for a few weeks, but to think that person with those horrific crimes is going to get to trial within a year, that's something that I think would be nice if we could see that happen in Canada. I am reasonably optimistic that the U.S. justice system and the case that we've built with the other agencies involved is going to serve us to where it needs to be served. They are, for everything I've heard from our folks, is it's obviously treated as the most serious matter that it could be. And, we look forward to hopefully that person is going to be held accountable and not going to be visiting any communities for quite some time, if not for a really, really long time.
Yeah, so is it mostly going to be charges out of the U.S. at this point with help from Canada, or will there be?
Well, there's help because there's coordination of the file, right? So you got to bring the evidence forward, and we'll see what, if anything else has to play out, if there's anything that needs to be brought back here. But, the place of jurisdiction where the arrest is made and some of the offenses there, obviously in custody is going to deal with that first, and that's going to be based a large part on what the evidence we provide.
From your perspective, did this highlight some of the difficulties with online crimes as well, with child crimes, because we have this online system that is hard to track? It is easy to remain anonymous for some criminals. What was the complexities there?
That's a great question, and and it was asked to me, what are the things that we have to start paying attention to that are growing? It is that online and cyber. I mean, there's different components of that, but absolutely. And I mean, obviously we have that housed in Alert, which is our provincial agency, and the internet child exploitation, amongst other things. But that is something that we always are looking, gaining intelligence, meet with other people, not just in Canada, but outside of Canada. So, but it's changing. And then the other piece to that is just some of these scams that are going on right now. I mean, it's everywhere right now, and I mean, it's weird. I was talking to my own daughter about this just last night, actually, and about one of her friends that got scammed, and she made the comment to me, well, it's probably somebody that needed the money more, and I said, no, this is really, really organized. It goes back to that whole thing, is everybody tries to exploit somebody, right? And online is way easier than doing it face to face, because then you gotta, produce what you need to produce. So, and that's why also, if do you remember when we set up those exchange zones at our police stations? Those are used quite a bit, actually, and that's a positive. So, not just what we do as a reaction in the investigation, but what we can do to actually enable the community to do some of these things as a proactive manner to take away some of that risk is what we're focusing on.
Now, looking back to the year, something that you've apologized for, but there was that image released through DNA phenotyping that appeared, many people saw it as a generic image of a black man shown as a suspect in a case. And there's been questions around, how did that company that is not scientifically peer-reviewed, phenotyping may be peer-reviewed, but that company was not peer-reviewed, how did they come to be the choice of Edmonton Police?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, that whole move is last resort, right? I mean, I don't want to take away from it. This was a very, very serious case where we have a victim who's got life-altering issues as a result of it. So it was a last resort. The second part is the apology was we have enough checks and balances that a generic picture shouldn't have went out, regardless who the company is. So I don't want to look to blame this on the company. We took responsibility for that, and I think going forward, our commission has certainly asked us, and we do, is to have some type of ethics review process and review process when we're actually using new technologies. So those are things that we're working on right now. But honestly, it's not about the company. It's about, as you said, phenotyping is obviously got a lot of evidence around it, but you gotta, is the squeeze worth the juice, right? You got to look at it from a perspective of the community as well, and good part is our folks took responsibility for that, and we'll be better for it.
I have a political question
Oh,
here.
there's a shocker. What a shocker,
What
huh?
a shocker. There's been so much in politics this year, but there's been a lot of talk about a provincial police force in Alberta moving towards a provincial police force, regardless of public opinion on it, that we've been told it's going to happen. How could a provincial police force and needing to work with Edmonton Police and the transition impact Edmonton Police?
Well, I mean, first of all, this provincial policing discussion, it's not just in Alberta, it's going on a lot of places, and I think when you look at it, some of the problems stem back to provinces, because I had this file as a federal provincial territorial deputy, actually, that I co-chaired, and it was about, having the say coming from what you're trying to do locally out of Ottawa. So that governance piece is really at the heart of some of this. It's not necessarily the police service, it's the governance, right? And the ability to work locally. We'll see. I certainly haven't heard lots about it lately. I think this discussion is going to transpire in many different provinces. It's just an evolution discussion, but for us, if you look at it, when it did happen in Ontario and Quebec, for instance, some of it also includes regionalization. And I think, we don't talk about this enough, but you go back to costs, you go back to, looking at more efficiencies, you look at better intelligence. I mean, certainly Edmonton is in a position, if communities want and if that's so they desire, I think regionalization makes a lot of sense here. Honestly, we have all of the things that any police service would have, right from the supports to the investigations to the ability to tactical and everything in between. So, generally these discussions have a regionalization component. We haven't seen that yet, and we'll see, but if there is, I think that's an opportunity that certainly I thought we'd have probably been talking about a long time ago, but it doesn't seem to be anything that's on the current agenda. So, it's got to be led by political leadership. It's not necessarily led by police services. The RCMP officers are fine officers. It's not about that. It's about governance, and it's about being a LAC local and feeling that you're LAC local. And so, we don't wade into that discussion because that's others to sort it out. But if it does happen, regionalization is a possibility, and for us, if that does come, it makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. And just moving back to the budget, there's been a lot of talk about cameras, not even just body cameras, but cameras in vehicles, which seems like a very 2010 question. Why has it taken so long for this request and this work to be where it's at? Yeah,
that's a good question, and from what I'm hearing, it didn't get approved in the budget. So it was one of the things that, the car cameras, first of all, start with that one, has a lot more 360-degree feedback. You still get your mic, a lot of your stuff where the majority of your interactions are, vehicle stops, etc., going to a call. For us, it's become, we'll definitely go there. We just need the money to go there. And that's not coming. So even though the task force asked for it, it was put in our budget, but it's not making it through to those folks that actually fund it. And here and again, we are piloting it anyway because we had some money. We're piloting it. We know what the answer is. We absolutely need to get there. Our members want it. The community wants it. But it's the funders that seem to. It's kind of that you have to have money to go there.
Yeah. I guess the devil's advocate question there is, why hasn't the money been found within police budgets that already exist?
Because of the other 50 reasons that we've been finding money to do other things. And at the end of the day is, there's not a lot of waste in the Edmonton Police Service, contrary to what some people think. We're a busy police service. We're one of the busiest police services. As you heard, calls per incident, we're one of the lowest. And that's usually a result of you need to attention, and that's what we've been focusing on, trying to reduce the calls for service. Ultimately our whole plan was to actually reduce some of this stuff, and I think we were on track to doing it. But when you don't stick with a plan and see it through and then evaluate to see if you made success and make adjustments, then what happens is you get momentum and then you lose momentum, and that's where we are right now. Now that said, is we gotta obviously figure out how else and what else we can do, but I can honestly see, and I've been, again, through policing, through many different agencies, looked at this economically, been in charge of this as a province. There's a little bit of myth going out here right now, just how fat the Edmonton Police Service. It's not. It does need to start bolstering, and we are going to start seeing a recruiting pinch, which we went from 1,200 to 400, and some of the rhetoric out there right now is not helping.
Mm-hmm. Now, just going back to the Chinatown homicides, the man accused, not from Edmonton, is out on bail in a different community and gets dropped off here by RCMP. I know that's all being investigated, but does that speak to larger issues of Edmonton being a hub, not just for the region, but for northern Alberta and in some of the criminal activity we see?
I think I've said that 100 times, 100%. Yeah, it does. And but that's also why it's nice to see the province step in and say we got to look at this differently. We are a hub, but we're not acting like a hub. and we're trying to solve problems for the north and other areas, that needs a different approach. And that, as you said, is tragic. And I mean, got to keep in mind the day they dropped off to a couple days later, we're still waiting to see how many services we're actually connected to, or if they were. So we need some answers in relation to that as well. But I think you could go out here and start interviewing people on the street and ask where they're from, and you'll find a lot of people that aren't from here. And then you ask them how they got here, a lot of the paths are the same, and you ask them why they come here, a lot of the answers are the same. And I think when you have those answers are the same, means that you probably need a bit of a different approach.
Now, just on LRT security and transit security as well, to finish off, I know we're near the end. We saw big outcry last winter, and then we saw improvements, but it also happened when the weather got better. And now we're seeing, even with some of the action taken, again, these calls for more to be done. What can actually be done?
Well, I think we're seeing a better coordination than we've ever seen. And, I know the city manager and I talk about this lots, and between him and I and, Cheryl Whiskey Jack of Bent Arrow, we've kind of taken the leadership on that to making sure that we're doing it. So I think we're way better than we were, but we have a ways to go. And I mean, if you think about it, in most cities that actually build a transit or do something, there's a security plan with it. And, unfortunately there wasn't. We're now trying to make up a security plan on the fly. And, that's having some problems. We are seeing a lot better coordination of resources, but it's one of those things is you have to be relentless and you can't stop. Just
the Pope's visit, to end on a bit of more of a positive note, that was a lot of work from your officers. What was that moment like?
It was just really, really, so for me, I'd go into our OICC, had the camera views, seeing how they operated. I mean, first, as you know, the Pope brings in a huge security detail, huge. I've never seen anything like that, and I've been around a lot of things. Thousands of people in the security detail, and then to see us in Calgary and the RCMP and the federal government working together on security, you can't fail at that, right? So, and to see the Pope Mobile arrive, and and I know there was controversy in relation to coming because it draws up some trauma and some memories to others, but overall the whole intent of that was heartwarming, and to see it actually transpire and to our people maneuver and seeing how good we are at that things also was it was a proud moment for myself. So as you said, a great example of working together for a great event, even though it was traumatic for some, but overall very, very positive experience, and just from my perspective, very proud to see how our people, again, over and over, act with professionalism.
And now we wait to see what 2023 brings.
Yeah, it'll be an interesting year, 2023. Yeah, I mean, you got a lot of things to unpack of what's happening in the recent weeks here, and figure out how we can tackle some of these things. And I think optimistically, I'm quite excited that the province is going to at least try to get a lot of this implementation going right now. And it's got a fairly diverse team, including Indigenous chiefs and others. Because if we don't get all hands on deck, this one-dimensional approach that we've been trying here for years is not getting us where we need to get to.